you going to answer it? But so you would say that still to text rather than talk, but I just want to point out that texting can be very expensive. Well, you know, it seems to me that we have these studies, and I'm getting some curious information here today that there are some studies that seem to indicate to me, Dr. Sadetsky and Dr. Leszczynski, there's some studies that indicate that there are findings that show that some people who have been exposed for long periods of time do in fact have higher levels of certain kinds of brain or head cancers. Is that a fair statement I just made? That there are studies that show that people who have had longer term usage of cell phones compared to another group have higher incidences of either brain or head type of cancers? No? Yes? Yes, Dr. Sadetsky. I was trying to find that.
Yes, I think that this statement is correct. I think that when you look at the data, you see indeed that in the first 10 years nothing happens.
Right.
However, when you look at all the individual studies that are out there, you do see something after 10 years with ipsilateral use, meaning, as you said before, holding the phone in the same side where the tumor occurred. And our study also showed increased risk for people who are in the high category of use. However, what we need to understand is that there are standards for research. These studies are based on very few users, because very few users have been using the phone for more than 10 years. Therefore, you know, I have two hats, public health as a public health practitioner and as a researcher. Now, obviously, for research, these observations are not enough. There is a discussion whether these observations are true or whether they are stem from methodological problems. So as a researcher, I do say we have a hint that something is going on, however, we need more research. But as a public health practitioner, I'm saying, wait a minute, this is a red light and we must do something. And especially since this something is very easy to implement, because all we need to do is to put the cell phones away from our body.
Dr. Davis, you said in your testimony, again, following up on this, is that you said you cite Dr. Sadetsky study, and you say that Interphone has studied people who use phones heavily for a decade, has found that where persons have used phones heavily for a decade or longer, there is evidence of significantly increased risk, literally a doubled risk of malignant brain tumors. Is that correct interpretation?
I cannot comment on the overall Interphone results, because the overall Interphone results are now under review. They are not published yet. What is true, I mean, what you said is correct when you look at individual studies published from the Interphone results, not the overall results.
But again, those are based on?
Those are based on people who are long-term users. The term long-term users is also not very correct, because we're talking about people who talked for more than 10 years.
Then, Dr. Davis, you said that the one researcher to have studied young people who began using cell phones as teenagers, Professor Lennart Hardell of Sweden, has found that those who started to use cell phones heavily before age 20 have 4 to 6 times more brain tumors by the time they reach their 30s. Can we get some documentation on that study?
Absolutely. In fact, tomorrow at our international conference that's being held just a few blocks away, I invite your staff to attend. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Lennart Hardell will be speaking to us by Skype from Sweden, where he will present not only that result, but additional analyses of unfortunately, of new cases. You have to understand that in the Scandinavian countries and in Israel, they have been using cell phones a lot longer and a lot more heavily than we have. So unfortunately, they have some of those data. I should also add that one of the most troubling findings is a series of studies that have been produced in the United States. This is one study that was done opportunistically at a fertility clinic, and in Hungary and other countries finding a reduced sperm count in young men who keep their phones in their pockets, which unfortunately many young men do, even though if you read the advice that's on the iPhone and the BlackBerry, it says keep the phone 1 inch away from your body, actually 0.98 inches in case you want to be precise. But the reality is very few people do that. And lots of young men keep their phones in their pockets, particularly in the summertime. And the Cleveland Clinic published a peer-reviewed study showing reduced sperm count, and that was not the only such study, but only the most recent one.
Let me ask the question I asked Dr. Bucher. Okay, I've got my BlackBerry, which we use all the time. Again, just individual, I'll go down the line, Dr. Lasinski, and on down the line. If you were to use a BlackBerry like I do and you were calling people, if you had the option of putting it up to your ear like this and talking, or you could use a earphone like this with a little speaker down here, which would you do?
I personally, and also my institution, is advising to use earpiece instead of keeping cell phone to your head.
So you,
It is very simple way, very cheap way to reduce exposure of head to cell phone radiation. So I would use earpiece.
Dr. Sadetsky, any difference?
Same thing.
Dr. Erdrich?
I recognize that use of an earphone would decrease a person's exposure to RF. I don't think, I really can't agree that it reduces the risk, because I don't think the total picture of all the studies taken together with all their complications, I don't think this assessment suggests that there is a risk from using the cell phone.
Dr. Davis?
I brought my earpiece when you were talking, but I want to go on to read what the FDA and FCC site say, since Dr. Erdrich suggested to the contrary. The site, as of yesterday, says, the scientific evidence does not show a danger to any users of cell phones from RF exposure, comma, including children and teenagers, period. The steps adults can take to reduce RF exposure apply to children and teenagers as well. Bullet, reduce the amount of time spent on the cell phone. Bullet, use speaker mode or a headset to place more distance between the head and the cell phone. I'm continuing to read from their site. Some groups, sponsored by other national governments, have advised that children be discouraged from using cell phones at all. And then it goes on to say, for example, in 2000, in the UK, the Stewart Report advised this. And their recommendation to limit cell phone use by children was strictly precautionary. It was not based on scientific evidence that any health hazard exists. Close quote from the FDA website. It's in my testimony submitted for the record. The question we have to ask is, what is evidence? Do we insist that the only evidence we will accept is when we have enough sick or dead children? I hope that that's not the case, and that we've made some progress as a society in order to take the kinds of precautions that our colleagues in Israel and Finland and many other nations are taking today. And I especially want to thank my colleague, Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, who is himself a scientist, a physician, a researcher, and a brain tumor survivor. So his interest in this issue is quite intense and personal.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nedenko? Dr. Nedenko, the same question. Which would you do?
Thank you for this question, Senator. Based on our very extensive science review, EWG strongly recommends the use of a headset such as the one that you hold in your hand, and I think I have a very similar one. So.
Any difference between this and Bluetooth?
The Bluetooth is, of course, itself emitting radio frequency radiation, so when a cell phone is here, on the table next to me, the Bluetooth will be transmitted from the ear to the cell phone. The distance is shorter, so the amount of radiation Bluetooth would put out would be smaller than a cell phone would put out to a tower way out there. Based on our science review, we found that experts are split. Of course, our distinguished colleagues in Israel are recommending a wired earpiece, such as the one that you have. Our colleagues in Switzerland do feel that Bluetooth is a good choice. And then we have reviewed government websites from many European countries. We have found that some recommend both. Some recommend just wired, and we at EWG feel that either headset would be better than holding the phone to the ear.
My 7 minutes are up, but any on Bluetooth? Dr. Davis, we'll go back down this way then.
Yes, in fact, if you are using a Bluetooth and you have the phone away from your body and you turn it off when you're not using it, it does give you much less exposure. But the problem is that most people who use a Bluetooth have the phone on their hip, right at their bone marrow, and have it on all the time, and that is what we are concerned about.
Dr. Erdrich? Any difference between this and Bluetooth?
No comment on
No
Bluetooth.
comment? Dr. Sadetsky?
Yes, there are, usually it's true that the Bluetooth is better than the cell phone itself, but there are situations in which the Bluetooth involves higher emission than the cell phone itself, such as when the reception is really good. So because the Bluetooth is always constant exposure, while the cell phone adapts with the base station all the time. Besides, we in Israel were worried that when people wear this Bluetooth, it is so comfortable, it becomes part of your body, that they will just talk more and more, and therefore the overall exposure will be higher.
Interesting. And Dr. Zasensky?
Yes, of course, Bluetooth is very comfortable because you don't have those wires all the time hanging. However, Bluetooth is emitting radiation continuously, and we don't have slightest idea what this kind of continuous exposure of area of ear can achieve in due time. Therefore, it is much better to use this earpiece. On the other hand, also it's necessary to remember that, as Dr. Davis mentioned, when people have Bluetooth in their ear, they usually keep cell phone somewhere else in a pocket, and then this area next to cell phone is being exposed. If it is breast pocket or pocket in trousers, different areas will be then exposed. Not our head, but somewhere else this radiation goes.
Dr. Davis, what is the strongest evidence you know about an alleged causal connection between use of the cell phone and a brain tumor?
Well, the strongest evidence does not come from human studies, and that's the problem. When we're looking at public health information, we have to rely on experimental evidence such as that developed by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in this country and researchers in Europe, in the REFLEX project and others. If we look at experimental studies, we have very strong evidence. If we look at human studies, as Dr. Erdreich has commented...
Tell us about the experimental study.
Well, as a matter of fact, here we go. This is a model of the brain, and while the precise information in here has been debated, this is approximately the absorption that gets into the head of a 5-year-old, and this is about the absorption here on the blue line that gets into the head of an adult.
Well, that establishes there's more absorption for
Right.
Wait a minute. Just answer the question. That establishes more absorption from a 5-year-old, but that's not my question. My question is, what is the strongest evidence you have that exposure to a cell phone causes cancer?
All right. The process of cancer arises from many different insults to our DNA, the basic building blocks of our genetic material inside our cells. Researchers have shown that radio frequency signals at exactly the same wavelength as those of the new phones can cause heat shock proteins. Those are proteins that the body forms in response to stress, and those have been shown in cancer research.
Wait a minute. We don't have time for a treatise. We have 5 minutes.
Okay, I think I can do it in 5 or less.
No, just answer my question. What is the strongest evidence you have that exposure to a cell phone causes cancer?
The work that's been done on the COMET assay that shows double-strand breaks in DNA after exposure to cell phone radiation is very strong evidence experimentally. If we tie that with the human studies of Dr. Sadetsky and others that have looked at people who have 10 years of exposure or more, we put that together and we have strong evidence.
Well, Dr. Sadetsky has testified that you see something after 10 years, but she says that there are so few involved that she can't draw a scientific conclusion. Is that an accurate statement, Dr. Sadetsky?
Regarding the 10 years, yes, but first of all, I would like to say that I'm not sure that there is an association. I cannot be sure based on the current epidemiological data. But what worried me was that in my study, I saw consistent positive results, and they always appeared where there is biological plausibility. They did not appear in this group or in that group. They appeared in the more than 10 years. They appeared on the same side where the phone was held. They appeared for the heavy users, and they appeared in rural areas compared to urban areas, and this also has biological plausibility because where antenna is more dense, then the exposure is lower. So the fact that all of these indications appeared where they should have appeared told me that it was a really red light. But as a scientist, this is not enough, definitely not for causality. But it's indication that, according to my judgment, is enough in order to advise the precautionary principle.
As a scientist, it's not enough to conclude a causal connection. Is that right?
Right. For causal association, the criteria are much more stricter.
Dr. Erdreich, you testified that the evidence does not demonstrate a connection between cell phone and cancer. Now, it is much harder to prove a negative, but what would your answer be? Does the evidence demonstrate that there is no connection between a cell phone and cancer?
You've made an important observation. I think the evidence...
I haven't made an observation. I've asked a question.
All right.
I'm not having much luck with answers, but that's my question.
I think the strongest evidence is not any single study. The strongest evidence is that there is a body of research where we've looked at whether certain studies that showed anything can be replicated, whether we've looked at consistency across studies, and where there have been more than 40 animal studies that use different measures to assess the long-term risks. The evidence doesn't come from any single study. The evidence comes from a careful review, looking at the strengths and weaknesses together and putting the data together. This is supported by the fact that the Interphone studies, as Dr. Sadetsky states, taken together are kind of strongly not showing an association between use and cancer. So the answer I have to be
Do not strongly suggest a showing between the use and cancer.
It doesn't show.
But that's not a demonstration that there is no connection.
Exactly. What's important is that in the background context of what we know about the nature of the signal, the strength of the signal, how it interacts with cells. There's been research going on with this for over 50 years, although the research in the last 20 years is, of course, used improved methods and is more definitive.
I was once involved in a hearing which had a similar question. The question was, is there evidence that there was no conspiracy on the assassination of President Kennedy? You don't see the connection. The proof of a negative is very, very different from the proof of a positive.
Exactly.
And when you boil it all down, what I hear is not a whole lot of disagreement in this panel. You, Dr. Erdreich, say that there is so little question, in fact, there's no issue of risk at all that you wouldn't take any precaution. I find that... No, wait a minute, I'm not finished. When I finish and give you a question, I'll pause.